said graduation rates.
Great.
And for me, I would want a lot of options with majors and courses of study. I don't know if that goes with what you were just saying.
Okay, you know, I think it's different. So, number of major options. So the idea would be that the more diverse the options, the better the score would be. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. In relation to graduation rates, also retention rates.
Yes. And I see these connected as well because, as you might remember from a few classes ago, we talked about the different ways of defining graduation rate, right? So it's perhaps not just important to look at 4-year or 6-year and graduated from that institution, but also to know graduated from any institution, right? I mean, you probably want to know both. What else?
I think I would want to piggyback on top of graduation rates specifically for first generation and minority students, because if they're able to graduate those individuals who will potentially be more needy, they will be able to have services and support.
Okay, I'm going to put equity in success by first gen, or perhaps race, or SES, or gender. You can input here LGBT, right? Etc. And success you're defining as grad rate. Anything else? That pretty comprehensive for what you discussed? Oh, Katrina.
Internationalization.
Yes, okay, good. See, okay. Because I did want to see some of your values coming through here.
Try really hard not to be biased.
No?
Nobody else was saying it.
Okay, let's be clear that any ranking system is inherently biased, right? Any ranking system is, actually Daniel, I think you brought this up the other day, is inherently exclusionary, right? The purpose is to rank on something, right? So there are always values. There is a value in GPA, college GPA. There is a value in graduation rates, right? There's a value in internationalization. So there's always going to be a bias because rankings is inherently, I mean, it's the purpose. Is ranking based on what, right? So this was your chance to stake a claim on what higher education should be evaluated by, right? Interestingly, what we have here are, now we'll get to the few exceptions, but many of the things that we have here are in current metrics, right? I mean, a lot of what's on here is in US News, for example, right? A lot of what's on here is in the VSA that we talked about, Voluntary System of Accountability. Let's look at the ones that really aren't included yet. And I'm going to star this because learning outcomes are mainly used formatively currently rather than summatively in a ranking system. This I find interesting. Enjoyment. So I'm going to star that. Okay, these are all included. When you said transfer students, what did you mean by that? Just how successful they were, or the proportion of transfer?
Yeah, I guess the percentage of which.
Oh, students that transferred out?
That, or the ones that come in, like the percentage that come in. I guess you really, like in many of these, they don't include transfer students. Like what's the retention rate of students who leave, but also the transfer students coming in.
Okay, so that might actually be more in this, right? But by transfer, right? So you want to know they're a different slice, basically. Yeah.
Does she mean an attrition rate, maybe?
Attrition. Would we not get at that here in the retention piece?
I was adding to the transfer piece that she was mentioning.
Yes.
Maybe what rate of students actually transfer out.
Yes. So this one might be, yeah, this could be transfer out, and this is cutting the experience by those who transferred in or not. Yep.
I think also the retention rate after each year should also be a huge thing. Like what happens after their first year? Are they staying or are they transferring out after the first year? And if it's a bigger percentage in the first year than in the fourth year.
Yes.
Or if it's consistent where the retention rate is fine throughout the 4 years of one particular school.
Well, that falls under attrition rate though. You're transferring out.
No, I'm just saying like, as far as graduation rates go, like to split it in over 4 years, rather than just one solid rate. That's all.
Do you know what? Actually, now that I'm starring, there's quite a few in here that are not included in current rankings. We started out with a few that perhaps are. These are, although they're not used as controls, right? So one of the things that's interesting is in current ranking systems, the inputs are used as the measure, as opposed to a control for the measure, right? So the idea of being, instead of being value added, which would be to say, okay, we started with students who knew this and then we gave them this, to say, okay, we're interested in what they would call the peer effect, right? How smart are the students going there? Because that might influence how good the institution is, right? Okay. All right, interesting. Here we go. Yes, actually, I was not giving you guys enough credit. And this too. Okay. So, all right, so let's take a look at the ones that were not currently in most ranking systems right now. We've got learning outcomes, job enjoyment, although we do tend to see job placement being something that's looked at. Environment, the environment or the climate, equity and success by various kinds of students, the ability of the institution in internationalization, fulfilling their stated mission. Agency, meaning helping students to fulfill their own goals, whatever they perceive those goals are. Community impact, teaching quality, and stratifying by program, and the number of major options. So what do we see as the difference between the ones that are starred and the ones that are not starred that are currently in ranking systems? Yes?
I think the items that are left out are ones that are harder to quantify.
Yes. Yes, so we definitely have methodological challenges. Methodological. Can you give me an example?
For example, the one that our group chose, fulfilling stated mission.
Okay, so why would that be hard to measure?
I don't know, it's quite nebulous. Like if you were to interview, if you were to, I guess, ask a university to conduct that evaluation on their own, chances are they're going to say, yes, we are living up to our mission.
Yes.
And how is that going to be assessed across institutions?
Right.
I think it's a good metric, but how do you design it in a way that you can actually measure it in a way that's consistent and accurate and so forth?
So if you're using, let's say, self-report kinds of data, which could be in focus groups, interviews, surveys, etc., you're going to deal with social desirability bias, right? By contrast, if you pulled, objective, well, we're not going to get into the nature of objectivity, but if you pull, so let's say one of the missions was to create good citizens, right? How do you find a metric that is not self-report, right? That would look at that. Well, you could say what proportion of students are volunteering or engaged. I mean, you have to define that, right? And one of the things that sort of comes up as we talk through this is institutional missions. How well defined are they? Does somebody have a device? Can you pull up TC's mission?
Are they all pretty similar?
Okay, yes. So the first thing is, which might be good for comparability, right? That they're all quite similar. But there's another aspect to these missions that I think might prove problematic. Does anybody have a device they'd be willing to pull up TC's mission? Oh, thank you. Great.
Couldn't
Daniel.
you, instead of comparing them all, can't you compare them to what they used to be in order to measure perhaps the mission creep?
Ah, okay, interesting. That would be different. Mission creep. Is everybody familiar with the term mission creep? Daniel, can you give a quick definition of what mission creep means?
It's when institutions slowly start changing and altering their mission from what it used to be before.
And usually, what direction do they alter it?
It's sort of all-encompassing way, I suppose. They try to include as many of the things that are either trend or what students are looking for in an institution.
Yeah, so one of the things you're getting at is usually when they change their mission, they don't drop their old mission, right? So they're not going to, let's say, focus on access and then decide, oh, we're going to be a research university, we're going to be exclusive, but they don't drop the access piece, right? They say, we're going to be an institution that values access to our students, and at the same time, we are a world-class university focusing on research, or so you end up getting both sort of tacked on missions.
Right.
But one of the things I think is important about mission creep is that it usually goes towards research institutions or goes towards striving in the rankings, right? So, so the question I would have about this is, would mission creep be good or bad in terms of the evaluation of an institution? But anyways, we're not gonna. Do you have, Yvonne? Do you have the?
We can't find it.
Oh, no. Okay, great, Joy, thank you.
It's under student development activities, mission statement.
Wait,
It's not
oh,
the
no,
mission
that's
statement,
not the
it's
broader-
It's on the
Yeah.
diversity mission statement.
But that's it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it's really reflective of the school.
Okay, so guess what? We just ran into a methodological challenge. Yes.
Very reflective.
I think you
On
might
the-
have
on the same page that it has the Teachers College Diversity Mission Statement, it says in About TC, the college is committed to a vision of education writ large, encompassing our 4 core areas of expertise: health, education, leadership, and psychology. And then it goes on to say, Teachers College has continued to engage in research on the central issues facing education, prepare the next generation of education leaders, educate the current generation of leaders in practice and policy to meet the challenges they face, shape the public debate and public policy in education, and improve practice in educational institutions.
Okay, interesting. And sorry, where did you find that?
That's on the welcome page.
The welcome page. Okay, that sounds good. So, how measurable is that? One of the things that is interesting is there's been some research that looks across missions in higher education, and the basic conclusion is that it's almost like empty promises, right? Because they're so broad, and they say things like excellence, right? Well, what does that mean? So I think that, yes, so this is a really good idea that allows each institution to be tailored to what they're intending to do, right? One of the criticisms of rankings is that it sort of gloms together lots of different kinds of institutions that all have different kinds of missions, different kinds of populations. So this is trying to tailor it like that. But how measurable is it? Okay, so we're only going to spend a couple more minutes on this, but so we said in terms of the difference between the starred items and the non-starred items that that they are less measurable. I agree. So they're harder to do. They would require more money, more time, and perhaps more thought process in terms of conceptualizing the concept, right? Sorry, that was a little redundant. Conceptualizing the way to define each term, right? So for example, what is learning, right? What is teaching? And what is quality of teaching in higher education, right? That would be a lot more difficult to do, let's say. Impossible? Thoughts? You think these are impossible to measure?
I don't think they're impossible, they're just going to be very difficult. And I think you would probably need to use some of the actual, they already established topics like GPA and satisfaction to be able to figure out teaching as a class quality. Or like research and
learning outcome. But yeah, just to sort of calculate this type of, I guess, environment or climate, you have to use some of the already established norms that are already in colleges, universities.
So you might use indicators that are more specific to tap a broader construct,
Yes, it's possible,
but hard to do.
I was gonna say use like a common rubric for those particular things, just to make it easier across the board for all the schools.
So you define the certain aspects of teaching quality that were of interest and use that in a rubric. Excuse me. So other than the fact that these are not easily measurable, do you see any other kinds of differences between what's here and what's here? Yeah.
Is it, like subjective,
Okay.
that star, so Prashika is based on opinion?
Okay, so perhaps more subjective versus objective. Although, interestingly, you still make decisions about how to measure all of these, but perhaps these are more subjective. Yeah, I could see that.
As we already talked about, a lot of these are inputs and outputs, but the stuff that we suggested goes more into what's actually happening at the schools.
Yes! Yes! I definitely see that as well, right? So most of the starred items are really, they're not in the black box, right? They're stuff we already know, it's already being reported, it's in, it's out. We still really have no idea what's going on in the center. What are institutions actually doing in their education? But I'm so proud. Look at the ones that we chose, right? This is all about the actual educational experience. And we know that there are certain kinds of measures out there like NESI and some others, CERU, Wabash, that are doing surveys to figure out these kinds, but they are mostly they're not being used for rankings, right? They're being used for the formative processes within institutions. So the public doesn't get to see this information. And yet, these are things that we value. And I think that the public would value as well. Okay. Well, thank you for spending time on that. So we're going to move into finance. Yeah, so feel free to take a moment, grab some snacks. I'm gonna snacks.
So like even a restaurant and a hotel was in? Everybody was off. Well, we got to go to French place. Okay. Yeah. Cute.
All right. So, we're going to move into finance now. And I wanted to say thank you. There was a very rich online discussion. And I appreciate that you all found that I forgot to skip Thanksgiving when so thank you, Kate, and a few others. But it seems like everybody found the discussion board. So one of the main takeaways that I saw from the discussion board was around why does college cost so much? And given that college costs so much, what can we do about it? And also, what does this mean for different populations of students? This was, I think, a lot of what the discussion was about on the online. So what I'd like to do actually to start out the class is just take a few minutes, if you could talk in your smaller groups about just just brainstorming why it is that college, quote unquote, costs so much. Why does college cost so much?
They call it the fraction. I said like so it goes more admin becomes more also
Mark is still there.
I feel like it's because they can't apply any better
Because that whole market, students asking for some more street causes doing research. Administrative and more annoyed enough people that they have a stick in place there. The highest paid. Yes. Yes. It just gets bad. And I'm not a big fan of the college sports. Those athletic programs actually bring in. But that's because they're actually making programs. I think that's a lot. But it's not because they out of tuition because they get
people will still perception because like in stereotype and prestige
Which is interesting. That was one of the questions I asked in the discussion. No, it's my research. Like in all schools, they're forced to turn in data showing their like learning outcomes, and we found that like some regional for-profit college, some of Arkansas was actually teaching students more than Harvard. Like, how much would that upset the system?
So as a result, high tuition, aid model, but increasing
We'll get that.
A lot of economists would say it's privatize things if you allow private institutions to allow competition and that will drive costs down. But there are exceptions of there's no real education. The private institutions, the public institutions actually mirroring it. There's nothing holding instead of they're actually
So you always have the same tuition. They'll raise tuition, and they know that the government eventually will just raise the student
That's
aid.
why I say like because they can.
He said North. University A and University B. University A might not rise to University B because University A has a better reputation. You will pay 3 times for University A.
Right. In other words, they're learning to the students, forcing the students to then take out from the private loans, turning to the government loans. Whereas before, during the there was more on the capital market to subsidize higher education. Now, a lot of that
tuition fees cost both private and
yeah, you would think
Okay. Is everyone about ready to bring it back together? Okay. So the question was, why does college cost so much? First, I'm curious how did you interpret that question? So, for example, yes, Allison.
We, I think, have interpreted that as why do we have to pay so much to get an education?
Okay, great. So it could be interpreted as tuition. Did everybody interpret it as tuition? Okay. Is there any other way that it could be interpreted?
Why does it require so many resources by various parties?
Yes. Overall, institutional resources. Okay. So, but we're going to focus on tuition because that's where everyone went. All right. So why is tuition so high? Yeah, Rachel.
Because the cost of healthcare is so high.
Oh, okay. Let's hear this one.
A high percentage of the cost of education is in benefits. It's in salaries for personnel, and then supplying their benefits is a really big part of that.
Interesting. Okay. Benefits are high. So, gosh, if it weren't for Obamacare, we could just have everybody have no benefits and have really low tuition.
No, I think it's in salaries.
Okay.
That's the bulk of,
Salaries. Okay. Yes.
We said because they can.
Okay, tell me more about that.
We said people will still pay for astronomical tuition because of the stereotypes and the prestige that comes along with obtaining a degree. And it's a position of social status and also access within the world, just our whole economy, just jobs and everything.
Okay. Yes. So one of the things that's really interesting about higher ed is that it follow many very typical economic principles, right? It doesn't follow supply and demand. Why doesn't it follow supply and demand exactly? Erica, and then Lynn Marie. Huh?
It's already in demand because people need to get the skills to go off into the workflow.
Okay. But there's lots of things where the demand is always high. Why is higher ed different? Lily Marie.
Well, one thing we talked about was colleges and universities aren't all created equal. There are different tiers of them, and so people are willing to pay more. Let's say to go to let's say, just pick one, to go to Cornell than to go to Kansas State because they're not expected to do the same school. So people are like, oh, well, of course it would cost more. So of course they can charge more.
Okay. So that makes sense to me, except you can think about lots of industries like that, right? Like cars, for instance, there's lots of different kinds of tiered industries, right? So why is higher ed different in this respect? Alex?
It doesn't exist I think two reasons. One is it's a lot more government supported, so that throws it off. And
Yes.
the second would be that it exists in less of a zero-sum format.
Yes.
Universities are encouraged to spend all the money they take in. They want to bring as much as they can, and that is a cycle that feeds upon itself that sort of distorts how normally supply and demand functions in private businesses.
Yes. So really, the idea of price almost isn't real, right? Because the government steps in. Kate?
Also, typically in the supply and demand model, there's an actual measurable physical product, and in the higher education atmosphere, there really isn't one.
Yes. What is the product? But let's say we picked the degree as a product, right? Even if we picked the degree, I think Alex, sorry, Daniel, you had your hand raised.
I was going to say there's always going to be a built-in demand of students. Every generation goes to college, and even during economic recessions, there are always people returning to school to sort of keep up their skills or for new training. So it doesn't follow the supply and demand model. There's always that new generation, built-in generation of students always going from, 18, going off to college, and another generation does the same.
That's true. But there's also built-in generations that use toilet paper. And we don't see that rising astronomically, right? So there's lots of different markets where, the one generation, and not just generations, but okay, there's the whole idea of necessity in economics, right? So, and we wouldn't we can always go in the direction of talking about whether higher ed is a necessity or not. But anyways, or privilege, et cetera. But anyways, the point being that this idea that, okay, it doesn't apply simply because there's so much demand. I'm not sure that I buy that. I think we see that in lots of other areas, and the prices do not rise. Yeah?
I think it has to do with the fact that the U.S. is a bit of an anomaly in the sense that a lot of institutions in the U.S. are actually private compared to a lot of other countries where most institutions of higher education are public. And this works just fine if the government operates on a high tuition, high aid model, but increasingly it's high tuition but low aid, and that's falling apart now. So the idea is you get a lot of benefits from private institutions, there are more choices, there's more competition, and that's fine as long as the government provides the financial aid for students to go, but now increasingly the government is not providing the same amount of aid, there's a higher reliance on loans instead of grants, and now it's making higher education increasingly inaccessible.
Okay, all right, a few different points in there. The privatization piece is really, really true, and actually I'll show you a graph in a little bit that shows sort of, one of the things that's really interesting is that, yes, tuition has risen in the public sector, but where we've really seen the tuition rise has been in, as you all know all too well, right, the private sector. Okay, and then, okay, we had privatization, and then we had high tuition, low aid. Okay, interesting. Yes. Okay, so yeah, I think this point is really interesting, right? What is the incentive for institutions to do differently, right? And it's fascinating. We didn't include affordability in our rankings before. There was nothing about affordability in there. That's interesting. I'm surprised from TC students. So why else does college cost so much?
Well, actually, I've been thinking, or I've been observing the difference between European and American education, and obviouswhen it comes to tuition fees, especially for the European citizens, the fees are much lower across the ocean. And I could just from observation, I think there are three main differences. The first is that U.S. colleges provide so much services for students that, this increases the price. This increases the cost. For instance, just an example of, I was telling my partners here, is the swimming pools. There are many large institutions in Europe, but they don't have swimming pools, so this is just fine. They don't have facilities, they don't have gyms, or they have them, but perhaps in worse shape. The conditions aren't as good as the ones you guys have here. So this is like just to maintain the pool, this is so expensive. You can pay so many. You can actually lower the tuition fees, or you can just employ more researchers. Another thing is that there's such a liability, legal liability, that actually you have to invest to actually buy a good insurance plan for anything you do. That this also must increase the cost immensely. I've been actually involved in one project at uni, and they've been spending so much time to actually talk about liability and how to ensure that if something goes wrong, they don't have to pay for it. And the first thing, I think that actually the universities here invest more into marketing. European is following the suit, but not as much, and also this might also increase the cost, that actually, because you invest into marketing and making it look nice, the cost increases.
So going back to a few of these things, I'm sorry, I know many of you are interested in student affairs, But yes, this is one of the things that's very interesting, right? Which is that one of the things we've seen a major increase in over time is the various aspects of student services and the student experience. And one of the things we know is that that is actually very helpful to the other kinds of indicators that we care about in terms of graduation, retention, et cetera, right? So there's a good reason that we've done this. But I'm gonna add to this, I think kind of going along with this, there's this idea that more is better, right? And because the government is supplementing, right, the supply and demand curve, better to add services and add tuition, right? Because people pay it, because it's not real money. Daniel.
You could also argue that the reason for tuition increase has to do with the government. And I think William Bennett had mentioned this some years ago, where if tuition goes up, the government will continue to raise student aid. And so there's really no incentive for institutions to cap their tuition because they know that the government will always come around and raise the aid for students. Now, if the argument is, if then the government stops subsidizing students, then you have the reverse problem where people don't have access to higher education because they can't afford it, they have no access to loans. So that poses that kind of dilemma. But you can certainly make the argument that part of the reason is that the government is involved in subsidizing much of higher education.
Yes, and this goes back to the price isn't real piece, and also, so one of the things that I think that you were mentioning and Andy was mentioning earlier is that perhaps just recently we're starting to see a tipping point, right? Whereby the government says, nope, no more. We're going to change the level of aid. We're going to force you to feel the consequences of your tuition, right? And we're starting to see that students actually might be making decisions based on price. In the past, largely not because of the high tuition, high aid, but because we're now seeing this shift in mentality, the price is becoming more real, and perhaps price does matter. Can anybody give an example of sort of one of the ways we're seeing this change in terms of the institutions that are being more, that are increasing in attendance, in enrollment?
More enrollment into like state schools and public institutions.
Yeah, so, right.
CUNY.
Yes, absolutely, and also community colleges, right? So we're seeing a trend, for instance, where students might go to a community college for a couple of years and then transfer specifically based on price, not necessarily based on prestige or ability to get in. Right? So perhaps some of this is changing. But until this point, very, very little incentive to do anything because they could, right? Yeah. Any final thoughts before I move on to the next? This is really comprehensive. I can tell you read. Okay. So I'm just going to show you some graphs, and honestly, these graphs are mostly getting at what we just discussed. But I think sometimes it's nice to see it in a visual, and I remember that you all are very analytical with these kinds of graphs, so I'm pulling more in. Okay. I forget how much time it takes to on and off these blank things. Oh, there's a blank button, isn't there? That's supposed to make it much easier. Blank. Okay. I apologize, but I'm actually going to sit. Okay. All right, so here we have, one of the things that was really interesting was that you brought up that salary Oh, sorry, this is institutional revenues. We'll get to spending in a second. So, but here we're seeing the revenues of institutions. So, way on the left, we've got tuition, and then we have the federal government, state and local government. Can you read this even in the back? Is it readable? Okay, great. And you'll see that the colors mean different kinds of institutions. So I'll give you a second to take a look at this, and then I'd love some interpretations of sort of the main take-homes of what this graph is telling us. What do you see in terms of the trends?
Well, I can see that the Ivy League institutions have much larger endowments than public doctorate universities, which is quite shocking actually. You know, in comparison to Europe, for instance. It's not shocking in Europe, in the US context, but it will be different in Europe.
Interesting. So in Europe, the public...
Public are definitely much stronger when it comes to research and also when it comes to, you know, getting grants and getting money.
Interesting. Yeah. So what you're pointing out is the orange here, right? Versus the green. Yeah, that is interesting. And you might remember, and we'll actually get to. Well, oh, okay. Because it's coming up right now. Ah, what did I always think about? Ah. I think I showed you this in a class, one of our first classes, but it's important for this context as well. I think they're, okay, yes. All right, so I think I showed you this list in the context of history the first couple of weeks. Because, of course, all of the institutions that have the highest endowment are, they're Ivies, which also means they're the oldest. Yeah. And so I think another thing worth noting is this disparity, right? And I think Harvard also just set out upon some multi-billion dollar endowment campaign because they clearly need more. Because more is better. More is always better, right? Of course, the endowment of Harvard is larger than some entire countries. Yeah.
Yep, the GDP.
That's really scary.
Right, yeah. And they need $3 billion more. Okay. All right, so what else do we see here that's of interest? Scott?
Public institutions rely really heavily on state and local government, so it's no surprise that when those funds diminish, they try and make up for it by raising tuition.
Yes, and interestingly, I was actually surprised that the drop in state government support wasn't cited as one of the reasons for the increase in tuition, because we do see that direct correlation, right? So traditionally, and keep in mind this is from 2007, right? So traditionally, they've received most of their funding from the state and local government. We know that this has been declining, and that's been, oh my, that's been adding to this area. I saw it here, Joel.
Yeah, yet even though they're also still very reliant on tuition revenues. So even though they're getting a lot of support from the government, they're also getting a lot of the revenue through tuition.
Yes. Okay, so that's because they're not getting it through, right? Endowment, right? So very, very much less going on in these areas. So they sort of captivated over here. All right, what else? So you all have been pointing out some really interesting things. You haven't hit on the one thing that I think that I picked up. Where is tuition the massive problem? right? Private sector. So you all mentioned privatization as part of the problem, and I would agree. I think this graph supports that. Okay. So this is overall when we look across, right? When we look across public degree granting institutions. This is just another way to slice the data. But again, we're seeing the state piece be very important, right? Okay, then this is private, not for profit. And here we see, right, tuition and investment. And the takeaway is, right, massive declines in state appropriations for higher education. Oh, somebody's doing a fascinating paper on this. Oops, sorry, don't mean to call you out, but.
It's like part of mine.
It's part of yours?
Yeah.
So, so somebody was giving me some really interesting, who was it? Alex, was it you? No. Somebody's writing on state appropriations. Anyways, so what are some of the reasons for this decline? Daniel.
The view that higher education is a public good, not I'm sorry, a private good, not a public good, and that's I think the reason where they're shifting from aid to students to private loans.
Yes, that's absolutely so a philosophical change that has allowed them to think about appropriations differently. Kate.
Money's also being shifted away from higher education to other programs that are perceived to benefit people who are more in need or a greater percentage of the population.
Yes, yes. So for example, there's one study that shows a pretty strong correlation between increase in welfare dollars and decrease in higher education appropriation. Yeah, I think actually it's an important point. Of course, those of us interested in higher education who want to work in higher education, we think higher education is a worthwhile endeavor, but at what cost, right? What is the alternative? Because anytime the state appropriations change in favor of higher education, who's losing? Now, this ends here at 2000. What do we know we know this looks like a nice little upswing, right? But sadly. And so all of this can't be explained by the recession, but certainly some would say just overall there's less money as well in states because of the recession. Okay, so this is tuition and fees across time, and we always say that tuition is rising incredibly. But what's the so is tuition rising? This is in constant $2008, so it is accounting for inflation. Yeah. So my question is, so overall is it rising? Yes, it is. But what's the main takeaway here? Where is it rising?
It's rising in the public sector, but that's why I'm sorry, for the private sector, but more people are going to the public, and you can see why.
Yes.
It's not as much of an increase.
Yes, so we know that a majority of college-educated people are educated in the public sector, but those poor souls, I don't know any of them, who are being educated in the private sector are experiencing the massive increases here. And please recruit all your friends to TC. Okay, so this is different than the slice that I was showing before. So the slice I was showing before, where I brought up the website, was endowment. This is about fundraising. So this is, and this was in 2007. But this is millions of dollars of fundraising. What do you notice here? What kinds of institutions are we seeing? Does it look the same as the endowment list, or different, or Alex?
Not all of them, but looks like at least half of them are D1 schools.
Okay.
So you got Duke, UCLA, Michigan, Minnesota.
Yes, so we've got perhaps some kind of sports component going on here. Yeah.
A lot of them are like science or medical heavy schools.
Yes, and perhaps that also might even relate to which schools have hospitals as well. It's interesting, if you look at the funding schemes for institutions that have hospitals, it looks very different than the ones that don't have hospitals.
Can I have a question?
Yes.
Which actually is related to the slide you showed earlier. Texas A&M was something like the 5th or the 6th largest endowment. Do you have an explanation for it? Is it like because of the oil in Texas, or why would that be? It's not that strong, I think, in research, to my knowledge.
Yeah. Oops. Excuse me. I think that's really interesting, especially because we actually don't see it here,
Yep.
right? I don't have a good answer. Is anybody from Texas who might have a thought? Maybe.
I didn't get a question.
Well,
Oh.
I was asking because the Texas A&M was like the 6th largest endowment in the U.S.
They have a lot of engineering and mechanic degrees, and a lot of my friends who go there, they just make so much money compared to what they pay. So, and they have really hardcore loyalty. The Aggies are crazy, and they always go back, and they're lifelong fans, and they always donate.
Yeah, and but it's interesting because so they're not here on fundraising. So it makes me wonder if at some point in its history there was some massive gift, right? I don't know. But I would, the things that you just mentioned, I would have thought, but I would think that would also influence on the fundraising. Andy?
I think the way how they calculate it is also interesting because it's the entire UT institution, not just like UT Austin, which is a little unfair because these are all single institutions. Like saying UC having all of them combined together would sort of be very highly ranked, but they're disaggregated here. So there's UCLA, but not all of UC. Whereas I think the UT was the entire.
Was it, or I thought you said it was A&M.
It was A&M.
It was A&M.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's totally. That's interesting. Scott?
Just another thing to think about is that this does give us information on the investment return. I mean, after Harvard really recovered from the recession by having just a year or two of ridiculous investment gain in excess of like 20%, I think. So in terms of their endowment, so seeing those numbers might be interesting to how well university endowments, their returns are performing.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's not just do you have the money, but what you do with it, right? Okay. Was I there? Yes. Okay. So, and then let's talk about who's giving. Who is giving? I think typically we're thinking about alums, right? But interestingly, a massive proportion is being given by foundations, and this is fascinating too, non-alumni. Who do you think falls into this piece of the pie? Okay, so yeah. That's a good example. Yeah, children. Parents. Yeah.
Local retirees in the community.
Yeah, people in the community. Actually, one of the things that I think is most fascinating and also, well, in some ways most perplexing or even it makes me sort of wonder about the way financing is working and the way giving is working. But there are a huge proportion of people who give to Harvard who have no connection to Harvard and who in fact really shouldn't be affording to give to Harvard, right? Because there's this idea that giving to the best procures the best, right? So I give to Harvard, then I'm connected to Harvard, right? So there are actually, even more than just really wealthy individuals or parents. There's also just depending on the institution, there might be just a bunch of people who just want to give, right? And one of the things that's fascinating is that they give to the institutions that don't need gifts, right? they don't give to the ones that really could use that money to give, to lower tuition or to continue to be sustained as institutions.
What's the incentive for foundations to give to an institution?
Look, I'll throw that out. Why do you think foundations are giving? Joy?
I'm just guessing maybe like tax related reasons, if there's a benefit. I don't know.
Give us.
Okay, so perhaps tax benefits. Kate? Publicity? Publicity. Yes, so let's say it's a foundation that's really steeped in a community and then they give to the, big state school, right? Or, so there might be certain kinds of ties, right? And did you have something?
And there's also just like Bill Gates and the foundation, and they just donate everything.
Okay, I might, yes, I agree with you, and I might tweak just a little bit to say, okay, the actual belief in higher education, right? And so they might believe in the mission of a particular institution. Of course, development officers are constantly trying to find ways to hook people or foundations in different kinds of ways, right? By doing it altruistically. Okay. So this is so this is federal support for education broadly across time. So different kinds of education. So we've got elementary and secondary, post-secondary, federal dollars to research as opposed to the institution more broadly, and other education, which I'm curious. Like I would really love to see preschool here, for instance, so I'm curious what goes into this other education. But what's the takeaway here? So in addition to the trade-off with welfare, we're also trading dollars with, right? K-12. It's a little unfortunate to think about having to compete within across educational sectors, right? And I think, this is something for us as higher educators to think about, Obviously we believe in higher education, but at what cost? I mean, is this the right proportion? Is this the right proportion? Okay. Here we have the maximum Pell Grant appropriated. So, do you know what, to be honest, this isn't that helpful because we're ending in 07, right? So what we need to see is a little further into the future. But so overall, we saw massive increases here in the late 90s. And by massive, I mean, we're talking $1,000. But proportionally, there was some really strong increases. And then what happened? Leveled off. And this goes back to the comment that you made earlier about, the change in mentality about high tuition, high aid. Yeah, Allison.
I think when I was in school in 2009, it was either still 4,300 or had, shifted a little and gone back, but just at least 2 years ahead of that, it was about the same.
So we're not seeing a huge spike.
No.
Okay, that's helpful, because that is closer to being current. All right. So this is the purchasing power of federal Pell Grant awards. So, meaning considering the costs of education. How much does your Pell Grant buy you, right? And this here is not surprising, right? So we know that most of the tuition issues are in the private sector, right? And we know that overall tuition is increasing. So this is need-based and non-need-based state grants. and this is constant 2007 dollars in billions. This only takes us up to, okay, 07 again. But the major trend here is overall increase, right? But in particular, the new thing is merit, right? And what do we know about merit? Yeah, Kate.
Students from better socioeconomic backgrounds tend to do better to begin with, so awarding them merit scholarships seems sort of pointless.
Yeah, and the merit, we know that the merit scholarships do go to higher SES kinds of students. Okay. All right, so let's look at who's getting scholarships. Okay, so actually I kind of put the cart before the horse there, huh? But here we have distribution by family into income quartile. So this is the highest quartile and this is the lowest. And then who's getting the scholarships. So the lowest quartile is mainly getting the federal grants. When we look at the merit grants, that's where we see an increase up here, right? And that goes for both state merit grants and institutional merit grants. And then the other thing that I find really fascinating, institutional need grants. Right? That's interesting. Wonder how they're defining need. Okay, so here's finally expenditures. We've been talking a lot about revenue. So let's see if you're, okay, so let's see if some of our assumptions in our conversation were correct. So what costs the most? Huh? Okay, yes, so first of all, look at the private costs across, right? And particularly instruction. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is that we don't know how instruction is defined, right? So are they including faculty salaries in instruction, right? Because one of the points that you made that I think is a really good one is that human resources are a major proportion of costs for institutions. So we don't see that down here. So I'm wondering if it's hiding, in this category, or hiding here. Where is that hiding? But perhaps one of the assumptions that we made not quite right is the increase in student services. Now again, though, perhaps, so you mentioned pools, right? And this piece. So I want to know a lot more about how this is defined, each of these. But it definitely varies by sector, right? Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left. And we've already talked about why does college cost so much. I just want to make sure, okay, great. So let's talk about the second question that came up in the online discussion for the last 10 minutes, which is, okay, given that college costs a lot, what should we do about that? What do you think should be done? So maybe take 5 minutes with the people around you and then we'll come back together.
Well, you're doing online education too for your child, so one thing that instruction being how would you do it?
What should be done about that?
First talking to her,
So when I was
that was hybrid, given their grade that we provided her.
really take a risk, assuming that we're going to be able to get a high-paying job. What is that going to
That's where,
then it's like
that's where they have
or they have to raise tuition.
But that's not. So I feel like that's constant. I know my education is masters from online.
Are you serious?
What are the strategies that we have for cutting down tuition?
I feel like mine are also idealistic, that's what I was like.
What do we have so far?
Yeah, it's more of an alternative. As an alternative to physically being in the classroom.
I'm not sure because there's a cost of maintaining these courses online, servers, maintenance. Right, that's true, but there are other costs, and that's the question. That's the issue, whether it's really less or whether it's about the same. You talk about brick and mortar, you talk about housing, lighting, and things like that. But there's also other things that go along with online learning.
Although I think initially it might cost them more because they have to come up with
Expand
a
the
new
servers
curriculum
and
that's
things,
effective.
Right.
Eventually, I think it's good enough because physically you don't have to be here and all those things.
Right.
If you come up with a curriculum, you can probably reuse it in a certain extent.
And then there's also more students,
More candidates.
more revenue. But, I'm trying to think, that raises some other questions about the effectiveness of it, and whether that would also just
All right,
water
everyone, I know
down
you
the
didn't have a ton of time to talk it over.
Because of the massive
But
massification.
briefly, so what is the solution to the affordability crisis? Briefly, in 4 minutes.
Shut down higher ed.
Okay, that's one way to do it. Well, do you know what? There are, I think, some movements that are trying to shut down higher ed as we know it, right? So, for example, what if everything became a MOOC, right? Or what if everything was a certificate training program as opposed to higher education institutions as we know them? That's out
exactly
there.
what we're talking about.
Okay, interesting. Scott?
One thing we came up with was exploring potential technology, particularly hybrid courses, to reduce costs while maintaining academic quality. In terms of mainly addressing that instruction bracket that was through the roof.
Scott, I remember you were really all about the hybrid courses. I see that as a good solution as well. Okay, and then you had something as well, right?
Yeah. We were talking about how if the federal government continues to just offer loans, then the states have no incentive not to lower their funding.
So if there was some sort of like matching agreement between the federal government and the state to regulate the cost.
Interesting, and you might even add like institution, state, and federal government, such that, you know, they would all have to collaborate in some kind of way, right? That would be interesting. Yeah. There was a hand over.
It was me, and then I changed my mind.
No, you don't have the solution, Allison?
No.
4 minutes?
No solutions here.
Other thoughts about, given that higher education costs so much, what should we do?
Right. Couple of things. One is shut down programs that are not self-sufficient. There's a lot of programs.
All colleges of education. Done.
Maybe, but certainly some collaborations, and I know one of the authors referred to it, but if you have competing programs in local schools right next to one another, say Columbia and NYU, why not just have a collaboration between the two and split the costs, or maybe cut down on the various costs involved?
Ah, so perhaps funding shouldn't be so institution-centric.
Right.
We've actually seen certain ways that institutions are trying to do this, such as library shares, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so there's some movements that way. Maybe one last, Katrina, are you trying to keep your hand down?
Going off of that same idea, I don't want to completely say like let's make all universities vocational schools that you just go to one, whatever major you're studying, but if we were to make like cuts, either services or majors, like try to not have universities be a fit everyone kind of model. If they weren't trying to do so much, but maybe offer less, but more well-developed majors. Like you could, for example, go to just a humanities university or just a science university with maybe just a few humanities courses, or a humanities schools with just a few other science courses, so that you can still get an interdisciplinary education, but the majority of the funding isn't going to these other programs.
So part of what you're doing is trying to address mission creep, right? And the idea that all missions are multifaceted, and if really we could focus more, perhaps we could do more with less.
Yeah. And also, going off that, this might have been what you were alluding to, but I know in Australia, you pay less money if you are a humanities student than you do if you're a med student. It costs less money to go to college, depending on what you major in. And I know there were times when I was in college, when I was paying so much money for printing, and I was like, there's no way it costs as much money for me to be here as it does for all the science kids. And then that correlates to how much money you make later on. So those medical school students are making that money back, the humanities students maybe not. So maybe that's an answer.
This is a model that's actually been tossed around. Absolutely. And interestingly, there's other kinds of things that I think are really different out there. Human capital investments, whereby foundations pay for your tuition with expected returns based on the salary that they think you'll make, which is kind of interesting. I mean, there's just a whole lot of things I think that we can think outside the box in this way. So, all right, thank you all very much. I'll see you next week for presentations.